From extreme weather events to record-breaking longevity, South Korea is facing two very different challenges that raise big questions about how the country prepares for the future. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It is Friday, August 21st here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. South Korea is showing two very different sides of its future: great exposure to extreme weather and some of the world's most dramatic gains in longevity. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Nice to be here, thank you.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us. Colin, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Steven, let's start with this summer's extreme heat and torrential rains. In fact, recent floods caused major damage in southern Korea. How severe is the situation there?
Based on some of the video that I saw on Gojedo, it definitely looked very, very serious. A local media quoted officials as saying that the province had recorded a record rainfall, something like a whole summer's, a normal entire summer's worth of rain in just a couple of days. So this definitely caught the drainage system down there off guard and led to some pretty serious property damage. I mean, I don't know if we have like a comprehensive figure for just how much damage was caused, but the people who were in the most vulnerable areas, the most kind of low-lying places that saw the bulk of the water, I'm sure there were businesses that have had to shut down. I'm sure there were people who had to leave their homes. So there's definitely been some extreme weather events in kind of isolated areas, but like when we talk about the weather here, I would just like to flag, today I was looking at the data that's been logged so far this year. This has been a somewhat mild summer. I mean, with the exception of the end of July and then a very serious heat wave that took place in the first week of August. If you look at the two kind of standard, what I take as being the two kind of standard measures, which are tropical nights and what the Korean government refers to as pogyeom days, so like days of extreme heat, days when the temperature exceeds 33 degrees, those have been lower than the past few summers. The past few summers, we've seen just consistently high temperatures, record-breaking frequency of tropical nights and of days of extreme heat. But this year, the numbers we've seen this year are kind of more in line with what South Korea tended to record 10 or 20 years ago. In that you see extreme heat at the sort of peak areas of summer, and then a kind of still hot, a kind of dull, humid heat as we see today in the past few days. So I just think when we talk about the extreme weather events, we need to be careful not to paint a comprehensive picture that this has been a super extreme summer on the whole. I mean, I hope that the folks in South Gyeongsang province will receive the help that they need, and I hope that we don't see any more really outstanding weather events like this, but on the whole, I'd say this has been a fairly measured and still uncomfortable but not hellacious summer.
Right then. Beyond national borders, Colin, I understand Europe has reportedly lost 1% of its GDP to this year's heat wave. What kind of damage has it seen?
Yes, there's a study that a company did recently about the GDP loss, European GDP loss related to climate change. It's been circulating in the media lately, and what's been focused on especially is the breakdown country by country. Which countries have been affected to what degree? How does it differ country to country within Europe? Examples have included in France. France is well known for its use of nuclear power, and nuclear power plants have to discharge heat somewhere. Usually it's into rivers, and if the river temperature is already high, if it crosses some threshold, the plants can't operate. So that threatens power generation and distribution there in France. As well, in Germany, the Rhine, the Danube, rivers like that are used for internal shipping. There's a lot of internal waterway shipping that goes on there in the way that it doesn't really in Korea. And of course, if those rivers, when they get low, that makes shipping more difficult, although a lot of sort of World War II artifacts and remains have been discovered as well. So there is an archaeological side to it at the same time. Or you have a country like Italy, a very tourism-centric country, you could say. The economy, a big chunk of the economy is tourism there, and they've experienced some hotel beds going empty because of the unusually hot summertime, for example. So are there lessons for Korea in all this? Well, Korea has had a tourism boom, but it's still nowhere in the league of Spain or in Italy or of France. That's less applicable. As I say, there's not much internal waterway shipping here. There is waterway shipping, but around the coast, so that's not quite so affected by water levels. But nuclear power, there's about a third of the total power supply here that's nuclear. So that might be something to watch out for in the future, what water temperature levels can do to the power generation here. That's the main, I think, takeaway, to use an overused word, that Koreans may have from the report about Europe's GDP and climate change.
All right then. Also here in South Korea, Stephen, the term climate insurance is gaining quite a bit of attention. What exactly does it mean? And do tell us a bit more about the measures in place to fight against heat.
I think what this kind of boils down to is a growing recognition of heat as something that's potentially dangerous and potentially harmful to the human body. I mean, Colin and I grew up in North America, and I think the conversation around hot weather was very different back then. It was something that people really wanted more of, something that people really looked forward to. For me, growing up, there was always a lot of lamentation that the summers were not longer, the summers were not hotter. People wish that they could do the fun things that, require hot weather, water play and, being outside and fishing and all the rest. But I think the increasing intensity of heat and the increasing frequency of it is just kind of driving home the point that the world is warming to temperatures that are at times hostile to human existence and hostile to kind of functioning outside. So really what this is a kind of provision of, in line with the general process of insurance. You pay into something and then you can receive coverage if certain eventualities take place. So, for example, if you get a physical ailment that is caused by heat, such as heat exhaustion or heat stroke, and you need to visit the hospital, you can claim some kind of insurance fees toward that. Or if you are in a line of work where extreme heat impedes your ability to work, if you're a construction worker and temperatures reach a certain point and your work is halted. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are already in place for other forms of extreme weather, like flood insurance or ice storms or wildfires. We've seen some pretty serious wildfires in Korea in the past couple of years. So I would take this just as another sign that heat is becoming, a potentially disastrous presence in the climate here, and this is just one way that policymakers are trying to grapple with it and try to mitigate its effects.
Right, and speaking about its effects, Colin, we also hear in terms like climate refugees and climate inequality. What more can you tell us about the uneven repercussions, perhaps, of the climate crisis?
Yes, I think climate refugee is getting to be a fairly familiar concept these days. At least the idea has circulated a lot. The idea being that in certain countries or parts of countries that will be afflicted more severely by climate change, you'll see more migration out of those areas. You'll see refugees coming from those areas, whether they're coming to Korea or other countries. And it's even become a concept discussed domestically here in Korea, in that we have people escaping the climate domestically or within Seoul. One example would be, this is the sort of theme that comes up every summer in the Korean news, but the conditions in what are called 쪽방촌, or they're literally divided room villages. And these are neighborhoods that consist of usually old, not very well maintained, not very large buildings that are subdivided and subdivided and subdivided, so people live in these rooms that are in some cases smaller than a prison cell and sometimes very long term. So they're some of the most poverty associated forms of housing in Korea are in these neighborhoods. And so every summer when it gets hot, there are articles published about how it's difficult to keep cool in a place like this. I mean, the ventilation and the climate control is about as good as you would expect in these places. And you can't install air conditioning, oftentimes because you don't have the money or because there's not enough space. These are all sort of cheek by jowl, or there's no window. And so what to do about that it becomes a bigger and bigger subject every single year. And some residents of these 쪽방촌, if they have the means, they escape, they become refugees to the local PC방, or big internet cafe, or some business with air conditioning, with climate control during the day, and they go back at night if possible. So that's a form of climate refugeeism within the city, if you like. But residents of these neighborhoods are also often laborers, if they're not older people, which is increasingly common, or they're migrant laborers, or they're construction workers, and they as well have been having trouble getting work lately because construction projects will be halted if the heat is excessive. So you could get a break of days or even weeks if the weather gets hot enough. And I think that's one respect in which watchers of the Korean economy will really take notice. Because it's so rooted in construction and has been really since the 1960s, if you see an apartment tower being built and it just stops for a week because of the heat, you'll think, okay, something's really gone wrong. So I think that will become an increasing part of the conversation, not just about climate change, but about the Korean economy going forward.
Right, for sure. Let's move on to another story, Stephen. A new study says Korean women could become the first in human history to reach a life expectancy of 90 by the year 2030. Do tell us more about this.
Well, that's the big takeaway, that Korean women could kind of set this global record for life expectancy. The question is why? What habits and what systems and what infrastructure are in place that will potentially allow them to reach this threshold. I think there's a few things that you could point to. I mean, South Korean women tend to have a kind of genetically healthy body mass, not a lot of excess fat. This is a country that I think a big part of Korean life expectancy is that most South Koreans live in walkable communities. I believe that there's a very strong correlation between living somewhere where you can spend your daily life just moving around and completing tasks and having contact with other human beings instead of living in a very car-centric sort of place. I think if you look at most of the places in the world that have very long life expectancy, a lot of them are walkable. And there's also just, the average Korean diet is generally pretty healthy. It's, a lot of produce, a lot of low-fat proteins such as tofu. It's just a lot of, I would say that in the past, one thing that might be helping this happen is that Koreans have very small families and parents are super focused on feeding their child nutritious food, keeping their child out of danger, inculcating healthy habits in their children. And so avoiding risk. I mean, Colin and I are both sometimes around small kids in this country, and I can tell you that your average Korean parents are very quite risk averse and very quite closely managing what their kids are up to, not leaving their kids unattended, and all the rest. So, I mean, I guess this is just like a kind of natural outgrowth of some pretty healthy habits that have been in place in this country for quite a long time. What the study doesn't mention too much is why South Korean men may not, like what's keeping them from reaching this threshold. I mean, I know rates of tobacco and alcohol consumption tend to be higher among men than women. Maybe South Korean men are involved in some more dangerous occupations, physical labor and things of that nature. So this is probably going to be another case where the rest of the world is looking at Korea and wondering if there's something worth emulating. How are they achieving this admirable and desirable goal? Koreans are already famous for excellent skincare, so this is another feather in the cap, I think, perhaps.
Right then, speaking about the rest of the world, Colin, the US remains near the bottom, I understand, in life expectancy because of health inequalities. How do Korea and the US compare when it comes to healthcare, do you think?
Yes, this is a statistically tricky matter because it does seem like a contradiction. You look at the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the world, you would assume that it's going to have the best outcomes because of that. Then you see the statistics and it comes up short in a lot of ways. So you think, what's going on here? Partially it's because of the diversity of the United States. And you have a diverse country, especially compared to South Korea. You're going to get a diverse outcome. You're going to get a diverse selection of outcomes. If you have a diverse population, people just won't be the same. I mean, by definition, I'm saying something completely tautological. So to compare, if you want to draw a comparison, as you say, between South Korea and the US more directly, it's best not to look at the statistics nationally in aggregate, but to compare South Korea to a more relevant population within the United States. So there are certain populations, I think, if you look at only them, if you isolate them in the US, they won't be that much worse off in these medical outcomes, health outcomes, than South Koreans. Maybe not as good, that's true, but I think the matter of relevance is something we shouldn't put out of our minds. I think back to the economist Milton Friedman, when told that there's no poverty in Scandinavia, said, that's funny. There's no poverty among Scandinavian Americans either. And so what he's getting at is, again, something about the diverse populations that exist to an extent apart from each other. And if you compare South Koreans as a whole to Korean Americans, I think you'll find a much closer set of statistics than South Koreans versus Americans as a whole, although I think still, as Steven said, the lifestyle is different, and Korean Americans are in general, like most Americans, on the heavier side than South Koreans, and they have certain lifestyle factors that are not as healthy as Korea. Some that are maybe a little healthier, maybe less smoking, for example, but I think it's not quite, if you compare relevant population to relevant population, the gap is not as wide as it seems.
Right then. Steven, generally speaking then, what do you suppose is attracting international attention to South Korea's healthcare system?
That's a good question. I think one thing that the rest of the world is perhaps seeking to benchmark is just the use of technology in how South Korea treats patients. South Korea is a country that has a growing population of elderly people who are going to require care, and a workforce that is always, either shrinking or remaining kind of stagnant. Healthcare and elderly long-term care are definitely areas that are known for some rough working conditions, not very high wages, and so I think the people who are running those kinds of facilities are definitely always looking to use emerging technologies like robotics, artificial intelligence to try to find ways of monitoring patients, try to deliver the things that patients need. So for example, if you can, instead of sending a nurse around to every old elderly person and having them manually check their heart rate or their respiration rates or whatever, presumably that's an area where where artificial intelligence is fairly amenable to be kind of scanning this data and then putting out digestible conclusions. This person has these types of physical measures at this point, and here's the way to treat them given this person's medical history, all the rest. And then another one, a kind of more sensitive one, I think, is the use of robotics. Can you have an automated apparatus to feed someone, to maybe even help them take their medicine, or maybe even provide them companionship? The foreign media every couple of years or so will put out an article, in this rural Japanese city, there's this robot that provides, conversation and companionship to the old people who live there, and is, prolonging their lives in that way. So I think Korea is an interesting case in that it has, as I said, an aging population, labor shortages, and a quite advanced technological manufacturing infrastructure. So it's logical to think that this will be a place where solutions emerge to problems that are increasingly prevalent in industrial societies all over the world.
Right. Colin, The Guardian claims that foreign women are coming to South Korea in search of better healthcare. How is this trend being explained?
Yes, this was an interesting piece because, as I've said many times on this broadcast, coverage of Korea in the West, be it the US or the UK, does tend to reflect the anxieties of those countries more so than sort of the nature of Korean society today. But it's not uninformative, and this article actually makes an interesting observation because it's focused not just on women, but on black women who come to South Korea. And that's an eye-catching headline. Why would that be? And then the one point made was that they didn't see themselves as receiving a very high standard of care in the US, and so came here to get usually some package of checkups, just get everything checked out, every medical service they needed all at once, which was at a much lower cost than it would be in the US, and was much more quickly done, quickly and easily, usually in one location, and packaged and sold in a way that was tailored to them as consumers. And this is maybe what I would underscore in this article more than anything else. It was about the difference in user experience, consumer experience of the US medical system versus the Korean one. Here, and I say this having in mind, next week I've got my own biannual health check. You can get everything done in one space. You book it at a hospital, you go in, and they test you for all kinds of different things. Usually these are tests focused to some degree toward the health conditions that afflict the local population. So for example, stomach cancer screenings are very big here. I don't belong to the population that is more afflicted by those, but I get the screening and everything, and I'm not sorry to do so, but I do think it could be a growth industry in Korea to tailor these packages to foreign tourists, whatever country they happen to come from, and whatever group they belong to, and whatever risk factors they have as a result of that. But yes, as I say, it's an eye-catching article, but it does reveal a difference in these medical systems, even in the US, where, as we say, wealthiest country in the world, and the medical system or industry there is not absolutely undeveloped. In some respects it is the most developed, but the complaint again and again is that it's not good for its users. And there's also this sort of cultural difference that in the US, there's not this sense that you go to the doctor whenever you're feeling bad. Here in Korea, I think I'm right in saying people go to the doctor, or the hospital as they say, for every sort of even very mild ailment they feel, it's straight to the doctor, who's going to be probably near you. It's not going to be hard to get there. You can go on the day, not make an appointment. And so there's a culture of just getting everything checked out preventatively or very early on when you're feeling symptomatic. And that's not so much the case in the US, especially with populations who are less economically advantaged, shall we say. And the lower down that scale you go, the more likely you only go to the hospital if it is an emergency. And at the lowest of the low, you go when you feel like you're about to collapse, and you go to the emergency room, and it's going to be a very expensive visit. You probably won't pay it. Someone will. But again, it's not the most efficient way to run things. But for many consumers of medical care in the US, they feel like it's the only way. So there is a cultural difference, there's a technological difference, and there's, above all, an organizational difference to be considered.
Right. Despite South Korea's merits with regard to its healthcare system, Steven, it ranks near the bottom of the OECD for its medical workforce, including physicians. What are the concerns that have been raised?
Well, and so just to be clear, like what we mean, I think, is the prevalence, the number of medical professionals relative to the size of the population. This is not a qualitative measure assessing these folks' performance or anything like that. So, I mean, this reminds me of 2 or 3 years ago when there was that very big strike of Korean doctors. I did a bunch of interviews with doctors, and I came up with the conclusion that the doctors see the system that they function in as kind of paradoxical. They see it as being, one of the best in the world in many cases in terms of meeting patient needs and, speed of visits and, the very low level of preventative deaths in the Korean medical industry. But doctors here are also under a ton of pressure because, as Colin laid out, there's a high frequency of doctors visit. There's the way that the system is set up is that the doctors are in their offices all day and they're just seeing a kind of deluge of patients, all generally for short times. So somebody comes in with some kind of an ailment. If it's something simple, the doctor can just prescribe medicine or carry out some kind of simple procedure. If it's something more challenging, they will refer them to a larger hospital. So the challenges that a lot of doctors laid out to me is that aspect of it, and also just the fact that the reason that there are not more doctors in Korea, as they explained it, is that doctors tend to earn less money than they do in some other rich countries, and doctors tend to avoid the undesirable places to live in the country, the undesirable forms of medical practice. For example, reconstructive surgery. There's a lot of some Koreans, when they have a body part that needs to be rebuilt, will sometimes even need to go overseas to get that done because there's nobody to do it here. And one that really I thought was kind of eye-popping is that in the Korean medical system, doctors who are found to have committed malpractice can even face criminal censure in some cases. So like if a doctor or a nurse does something that the legal system deems to be grossly negligent or even malicious, they can face they can go to prison, which I think is something that might make somebody who has, that really excellent student who has a lot of options, they might choose to go into a field where they don't have to confront that possible eventuality. So, but generally I would say that the Korean medical system is very good at a lot of things. It's very good at just kind of keeping this very densely populated and this very hard living country at work and in school, and hopefully that can remain the case and whatever kinks can be worked out.
Right, indeed. On that positive note, we end today. Steven, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Colin, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
So, from preparing for a more volatile climate to preparing for a much older population, the question now is how ready is South Korea for the challenges ahead? That's all this week. Thank you for watching.